Racist woman blocks Keanu Reeves from taking a seat in subway train. Faces karma. She didn't expect. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. New York City, 2017. An incident involving Hollywood superstar Keanu Reeves left onlookers stunned when an older woman blatantly refused to let him sit on the subway. What happened next turned the entire train car into a silent witness to an unforgettable moment. It was a crisp October evening, and the subway car was packed with people heading home after a long day. Among them was Keanu Reeves, dressed in a simple black jacket, jeans, and a beanie pulled low over his forehead. Despite his international fame, Keanu had always preferred blending in with everyday crowds. He quietly stepped onto the train at Union Square Station, carrying nothing but a worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder. At 53 years old, Keanu's rugged yet gentle demeanor still turned heads. But tonight he seemed focused, lost in thought. As the train jerked forward, he looked around for an empty seat. Spotting one beside an older woman with silver hair and pearl earrings, he stepped closer. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely, gesturing toward the empty spot. The woman glanced up, her sharp eyes narrowing as she looked him up and down. "That seat's taken!" she snapped, clutching her purse as if he might snatch it. A few passengers nearby turned their heads, recognizing Keanu immediately. Whispered murmurs rippled through the car, but Keanu remained calm, offering a small smile. "I'm sorry," he said softly, stepping back without argument. But before he could move away, a young woman sitting across from them stood up. "You can have my seat," she said, her voice loud enough to draw more attention. She shot the older woman a look of disbelief. Keanu hesitated, but as he turned toward the empty spot, the older woman muttered under her breath, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Probably homeless. Looks like one of those people." The subway seemed to freeze. The words hung heavy in the air, and Keanu stopped mid-step. For a moment, it looked as though he might let it go, but then something shifted. He turned back toward the woman, his face still calm, but his eyes filled with something deeper, something raw. "You shouldn't judge people so quickly," he said, his voice steady but low enough that people leaned in to hear. "You never know what someone's been through." The woman rolled her eyes, but a man sitting nearby spoke up. "Lady, do you even know who this is?" He gestured toward Keanu. "That's Keanu Reeves. He's probably the kindest celebrity in Hollywood." More voices joined in. "He's donated millions to cancer research." "He rides the subway like the rest of us. How many actors do that?" "My sister met him once. He paid for her groceries when she couldn't afford them." The older woman's face flushed red, but she said nothing as the crowd's energy shifted in Keanu's favor. Meanwhile, Keanu simply thanked the young woman who had offered her seat and chose to stand instead, holding the rail with one hand. What happened next, however, would leave an even greater impact, something no one on that train would ever forget. The subway rattled down the tracks, but inside that crowded car, silence settled like a heavy fog. The older woman, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in her seat. Keanu remained standing, his hand gripping the overhead rail, his expression unreadable. Yet beneath his calm demeanor, a storm of memories stirred. As the train rolled past dimly lit stations, a young girl in a pink hoodie tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, isn't that the man from the movies?" she whispered loud enough for the whole car to hear. Her voice broke the tension, and a ripple of nervous laughter spread. Keanu glanced down at the little girl, his eyes softening. "Yeah, that's me," he said quietly, offering her a warm smile. The girl beamed, but the older woman's scowl deepened. "Actors think they're so special," she muttered under her breath, though her voice carried just enough for people nearby to hear. This time, Keanu didn't ignore it. He looked at her, not with anger, but with the kind of sadness that cuts deeper than any words. "You know," he said softly, "I wasn't always an actor. I know what it feels like to be judged by how you look. I know what it's like to lose everything and still have to get up the next day and keep going." The train slowed as it approached the next station, but no one moved. Eyes were locked on Keanu, hanging on every word. "My father left when I was 3, he continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My best friend died when we were 23. I lost my daughter before she even had a chance to live." He paused, and a hush fell over the car. Even the clattering of the wheels on the track seemed distant now, and my partner— He swallowed hard, his voice nearly breaking. "She died in a car crash. I held her hand in that hospital room and told her I'd never stop loving her, even as the machines went quiet." A few gasps filled the space. The older woman's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Keanu let out a slow breath, composing himself. "So when you look at someone and assume you know their story, what they've been through, what they've lost, just remember, kindness costs nothing, and it might be the one thing that keeps someone going." Tears welled up in the eyes of several passengers, including the young woman who had offered him her seat earlier. Even the older woman seemed to shrink beneath the weight of his words. She opened her mouth, but instead of another insult, all that came out was a shaky, "I'm sorry." Keanu nodded, accepting her apology without hesitation. But just as the train pulled into the next station, something happened that no one expected. A man in a faded jacket and torn shoes stepped onto the train. He locked eyes with Keanu and froze. "Johnny?" the man said, using Keanu's middle name as if he'd known him for years. The resemblance between them was faint but undeniable. Keanu's grip on the rail tightened. "David?" he whispered, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. And in that moment, the tension in the subway shifted from the echoes of judgment to something far more personal. Something rooted in the ghosts of the past. The subway doors hissed open, but no one moved. The man who had just stepped in stood frozen, his eyes locked on Keanu's. The crowded train car felt smaller, quieter, as if the entire city had paused to witness what was unfolding. "David?" Keanu repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the rail, his breath uneven. The man's lips trembled, his eyes welling up. "It's me, Johnny," he said, using the childhood nickname only a handful of people still remembered. "It's your brother." Gasps rippled through the train, but Keanu didn't seem to notice. His shoulders tensed as years of memories came rushing back, memories he had tried to bury. "You—" Keanu's voice faltered. "You left." David took a hesitant step closer. His clothes were worn, his face lined with years of struggle. "I didn't mean to," he said softly. "I was scared. After Dad left, Keanu cut him off, his voice tight. "You ran." The train jerked forward, but Keanu didn't let go of the rail. The passengers around them fell silent, some exchanging glances, unsure whether they were witnessing a reunion or another fracture. David's eyes dropped to the floor. "I know. I don't deserve to stand here and ask for forgiveness, but I had to find you. I've been looking for years." Keanu's jaw tightened, the weight of old wounds pressing down on him. For so long, he had carried the loss of his family like a scar, hidden but unhealed. And now, here was David, standing before him, cracked and weathered by time but alive. The older woman who had refused him the seat earlier sat frozen, her gaze darting between the brothers. The tension in the car made her shift uncomfortably, as though the walls were closing in. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but quickly closed it again. "I never blamed you for leaving," Keanu finally said, his voice softer now. "I blame myself for not being enough to make you stay." David's eyes filled with tears. "No, Johnny, you were always enough. I just didn't know how to face everything after Mom died." The words hung in the air like fragile glass, threatening to shatter with the smallest movement. Keanu let go of the rail and stepped closer. For a moment, it seemed as though he might push David away. but instead he pulled him into an embrace. The train car erupted into quiet sniffles, and a few passengers wiped their eyes. Even the older woman looked down at her lap, shame and guilt etched across her face. David clung to Keanu, his shoulders shaking. "I thought you'd never forgive me," he said through tears. Keanu held him tighter. "We've both lost too much already," he whispered. "I'm not losing you again." The train slowed as it approached the next station, and the older woman suddenly stood. She turned toward Keanu, her voice unsteady. She paused, then cleared her throat. "I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier. I was wrong." Keanu gave her a small nod. "Thank you," he said gently. But before the doors opened, the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a folded photo. Her hands trembled as she handed it to him. "This is my son," she said softly. "He died last year." Cancer Keanu's expression softened as he took the picture. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She wiped her eyes. "I see now that kindness matters. I just hope it's not too late for me to change." The train came to a stop, but no one wanted to leave. The air was thick with emotion, as if time had paused to let them all feel the weight of their stories. And just as the doors began to close, David stepped back, his voice trembling. "Johnny, I need to tell you something about why I left." Keanu's heart raced as the doors sealed shut. Whatever David was about to say felt like it could change everything. The train rumbled forward, but the sound felt distant, almost like static. Keanu's chest tightened as he stared at David, searching his brother's face for answers to questions he hadn't dared to ask in years. David swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "I've been carrying this for a long time," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to give it to you." Keanu hesitated before taking the envelope. It was old, stained, and soft at the edges, as if it had been handled too many times. He carefully unfolded it, his fingers trembling. Inside was a faded photograph of two boys sitting on a rusty swing set, laughing, carefree, unaware of the storms that would one day tear them apart. A note was scribbled on the back. "For Johnny, no matter how far I go, I'll always come back." Keanu's throat tightened as he looked up at David. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. David's eyes filled with tears. "Because I almost didn't make it back." A hush fell over the car. Even the older woman who had insulted Keanu earlier leaned forward, her expression softening. "I got mixed up with the wrong people after I left," David admitted. "I thought I could handle it, but it got bad. I lost everything. Money, friends, even my home. I spent years living on the streets, too ashamed to reach out, and then—" He paused, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket. "Then I got sick." Keanu's heart sank. "Sick?" David nodded. "Cancer. Stage 3. Gasps echoed through the car, and Keanu's legs nearly gave out. He reached for the rail to steady himself. "You didn't tell me?" "I couldn't," David said, his voice cracking. "I thought it was too late, but then I saw you on TV one night, and it hit me. I had to find you before it was over. I had to fix this." Tears streamed down Keanu's face, but he didn't bother wiping them away. "You're not dying," he said firmly, his voice shaking. "You can't be." David tried to smile but faltered. "I'm fighting, every day. But I need help, Johnny. I can't do it alone anymore." The older woman suddenly stood, her eyes red and swollen. She clutched the picture of her son and stepped closer to them. "No one should have to fight alone," she said softly, her voice trembling. For the first time, Keanu looked at her, not with anger but with empathy. She had been broken too, just in a different way. The young woman who had given up her seat earlier reached into her purse and pulled out a tissue, offering it to David. "I don't know you," she said, her voice gentle, "but I know what it's like to need someone to believe in you." David looked at the strangers around him. people who had witnessed his shame, his desperation, and his shoulders shook. "I don't deserve this kindness," he whispered. Keanu stepped forward, wrapping his arm around his brother. "You deserve a second chance," he said firmly, "and you're not going through this alone. Not this time." The train slowed as it approached the next station, but no one seemed eager to leave. Strangers had become witnesses to something rare, a moment of forgiveness, love, and humanity unfolding before their eyes. As the doors opened, Keanu turned to David. "Let's get you the help you need." David nodded, but before stepping off the train, he stopped and looked back at the older woman. "Thank you," he said softly. Her lips quivered. "No," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for reminding me what it means to be human." The doors slid shut behind them, and the train pulled away, carrying with it the echoes of tears, apologies, and hope. But for Keanu and David, this was only the beginning of a battle neither of them could face alone. The night air outside the subway station was sharp, but Keanu barely noticed. He walked beside David, his arm steadying his brother as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on them both, yet there was an unspoken understanding. This was the beginning of something neither could have prepared for. David kept glancing sideways as if expecting Keanu to disappear. "I still can't believe this is happening," he said, his voice raw. Keanu stopped and turned to face him. "It's happening," he said firmly. "You're here, and I'm not letting you go this time." David looked down, shame flickering across his face. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Keanu shook his head. "Stop saying that." His voice cracked, and for the first time, David saw the pain his brother had carried for years. "You're my brother. That's enough." Tears welled up in David's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, unwilling to let his emotions take over. Keanu noticed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be strong right now," he said softly. "You've been strong long enough." As they started walking again, David suddenly stumbled, his knees buckling. Keanu caught him just in time. "Hey, hey," he said, his voice laced with panic. "Are you okay?" David nodded weakly, but his pale face told a different story. "I'm just tired," he murmured. "I haven't eaten much lately." Keanu's heart sank. He flagged down a cab and gently guided his brother inside. "We're going to the hospital," he said, ignoring David's protests. The ride was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from David. Keanu stared out the window, memories flooding back. Christmas mornings without their father, nights spent comforting David after their mother died, promises whispered in the dark that they'd always stick together. But those promises had been broken, and now Keanu was determined to keep them. When they reached the hospital, nurses quickly surrounded David, helping him into a wheelchair. Keanu followed closely, his heart pounding as forms were shoved into his hands. Words like immediate treatment and critical condition echoed in his ears, but none of it felt real. Hours passed in a blur. Keanu sat in the waiting room, his hands clenched together as he stared at the clock. The subway incident felt like a lifetime ago, and the faces of the strangers on that train flashed in his mind. The young woman who offered her seat, the older woman who had apologized, the quiet tears of passengers who had witnessed something they couldn't explain. Suddenly, footsteps approached. Keanu looked up to see the older woman from the subway standing in front of him, clutching a bouquet of flowers. "I didn't know if I'd find you here," she said nervously, "but I had to come." Keanu stood, surprised. "You didn't have to do this." She shook her head. "Yes, I did. Watching you and your brother made me realize how much I've taken for granted, how many people I've pushed away. My son." Her voice broke. "I never told him how proud I was before he died, and now it's too late." Keanu swallowed hard, his eyes burning. "It's not too late for you to be proud of yourself," he said gently. "You're here now. That matters." Tears streamed down her face, but this time she let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me it's never too late to change." Before Keanu could respond, a nurse approached. "Mr. Reeves." He turned quickly. "Is he okay?" The nurse hesitated. "He's stable for now, but the cancer's advanced. He'll need treatment right away, and it won't be easy." Keanu's knees nearly gave out, but he steadied himself. "Do whatever it takes." David was wheeled out moments later, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but still filled with hope. Keanu knelt beside him and took his hand. "I'm not leaving," Keanu said, his voice firm. "Not now, not ever." David tried to smile but broke down instead, sobbing into his brother's shoulder. And as the older woman watched from a distance, clutching the flowers she had brought, she whispered a quiet prayer for forgiveness, for healing, and for time to make things right. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a journey that would test the bonds of family, forgiveness, and love in ways none of them could predict. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the waiting room. Keanu sat beside David's bed, his hand resting lightly on his brother's frail fingers. Machines beeped softly in the background, each sound reminding Keanu of how fragile time could be. David stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "You're still here," he whispered. Keanu leaned closer. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." David's lips trembled. "I don't deserve this," he murmured again, the guilt in his voice cutting deeper than any wound. Keanu shook his head. "Stop saying that." His voice cracked. "You're my brother, David. That's all that matters." Tears welled in David's eyes. "I was scared, Johnny. Scared of losing you after we lost Mom. I didn't know how to keep going, so I ran, and I've regretted it every single day." Keanu's chest tightened. "You didn't lose me," he said softly. "I was always here, waiting for you to come back." David let out a shaky breath, and for the first time in years, the walls between them crumbled. The anger, regret, and guilt dissolved, leaving only the raw truth of their love as brothers. The older woman from the subway quietly entered the room, clutching the bouquet of flowers she had brought earlier. Her eyes were red, but there was a gentleness in her face that hadn't been there before. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly. Keanu shook his head. "Not at all." She stepped closer and placed the flowers on the bedside table. "I wanted to tell you something." Her voice wavered. "I judged you that day on the train, and it was wrong. But watching you and your brother reminded me of the son I lost." Her voice broke, but she pressed on. "I pushed him away with my pride and my bitterness, and when he got sick, I didn't know how to fix it. By the time I found the courage to try, it was too late." David's eyes softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." She shook her head. "Don't be. Watching you too has given me hope. Hope that maybe it's not too late for me to be better, for me to honor my son by living differently." Keanu stood and walked over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's never too late," he said. "Not for any of us." The older woman wiped her tears and smiled faintly before turning to leave. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me what forgiveness looks like." As the door closed behind her, David squeezed Keanu's hand. "You really believe that? That it's never too late?" Keanu nodded. "I do, and we're going to prove it. Together." The following months were a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and endless prayers. Keanu refused to leave David's side, even sleeping in hospital chairs and canceling film shoots to be there when his brother needed him most. The young woman from the subway who had offered Keanu her seat visited often. Her name was Lily, and over time, she became more than just a friend. She brought food, shared stories, and made them laugh when the days felt too heavy to bear. David's condition slowly improved. Though the road to recovery was long, he fought harder than anyone expected. And Keanu was there for every step, proving that family wasn't defined by perfection, but by showing up when it mattered most. One day, As the sun streamed through the hospital window, David turned to Keanu with a soft smile. "I don't think I'd still be here without you," he said. Keanu squeezed his hand. "You're not going anywhere. We have too many years to catch up on." David's eyes shone with tears, but this time, they weren't from sadness. They were filled with hope. And as they sat there, sharing a quiet moment of peace, Keanu knew that this wasn't just a story of loss and regret. It was a story of forgiveness, love, and the belief that even the deepest wounds could heal if given time and courage. Outside the hospital, the older woman stood at the entrance clutching a letter she had written to her late son. She smiled softly, knowing she couldn't change the past but could still honor his memory by living with compassion. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, it marked not an ending, but a new beginning. For Keanu, for David, and for everyone who had been touched by their story.